Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm sorry, it's like something on my screen. Okay, so I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I actually teach my graduate seminars exactly the same time, the MFA workshop. So I'm just going to chat with you on the video, and then um, absolutely you can email me, and if you have questions or want to have a discussion, or we can set up a separate discussion hour, a lunch or something like that. We can all Zoom together and we can talk about what I want to talk to you guys about today. Okay. So I'm Kazim Ali. I teach in the writing program and part of the literature department. And I'm super excited to talk to you about the work that I'm doing today and some things about it that may be relevant to some of the work that you're doing. The last time I came, I had a chance to, last year to hear from you about your fields and the work that you're doing. And several of the students in the group were doing work with Indigenous studies. So we were able to kind of talk about these writings that I gave you. Hold on one second. There's a lot of noise coming from outside. So I hope that's it's okay. It's like just craziness. And there's two other people who live in this house with me too. So people might be rolling through. There might be, the TV might go on. There's just no way of telling what's going to happen. So anyways, I did send over for you to read. I hope you got them and had a chance to look at them. A little bit of an excerpt from this book by Neil MacLeod, Creed Narrative Memory from Treaties to Contemporary Times. I'm going to actually talk about this the most. But I also provided just one chapter from this book, Decolonizing Research, Indigenous Story Work as Methodology. And I included a small chapter by the scholar Sarah Florence Davidson about using Indigenous story work principles to guide ethical practices in research. Now, when I went north to northern Manitoba, to the Pimicikamak First Nation, I was not prepared as a scholar. I was going as a memoirist and creative writer mostly. And it didn't occur to me that the work that I was doing was going to be research work, and that I had ethical responsibilities as a scholar. And even though the work that I did involves a lot of research after the fact, that's not the kind of book that I wrote, and it is not a scholarly, what you would call a scholarly book. It is a personal book. It's this one right here, and I'll actually read from it a little bit at the end after I've talked about it. And it's called Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water. And I'll talk about it in a little bit, just to kind of give you some perspective of what the story is. But what I mean to say is I was up in the Pimicikamak First Nation, talking to elders, members of the community, traveling around. I talked with members of the governing council, and I had my own experiences there as an observer and as a participant in different community meetings and a sweat lodge ceremony, which is part of the story actually, which I'll tell you about in a second. And so it was a kind of a mixture. And then when I came home, I had the book that I was intending to write changed in form, in that I realized that a lot more research needed to be done and context needed to be provided. And I did a whole lot of research when I was home to supplement the experience of when I was there. But in the book, since it's written as a memoir of the trip, all of that research that happened later is kind of stitched into the actual story of the book. So, so let me tell you a little bit about what happened. I worked on a book called Silver Road, essays, maps, and calligraphies. It came out in 2018, but I wrote it in 2015-16 time period. And it was a book that was very much about the various different places that I've lived and the concept of travel and the concept of conceptually crossing borders, and not just borders between nations, but borders between bodies, borders between genders, borders between language, spiritual practice as an attempt at border crossing between the human and the divine. There was a very conceptual notion of border crossing at heart in this book. But one of the things that I started to think about and wanted to engage with was my own childhood as somebody who was born in India, then came to, excuse me, no, I was not born in India, I'm confusing myself. Born in England, then went back to India with my parents. Then we moved to Canada. We lived in Winnipeg shortly, and then we moved up north into northern Manitoba, where my father was an engineer. He was an electrical engineer. He was working for Manitoba Hydro. He worked building a hydroelectric dam that spanned the Nelson River and provided, you know, cheap hydroelectric power to the south of Manitoba. And then we left when the dam was built, not quite even when, I think when the dam was almost finished. You know, my dad was one of the designers of the electrical system. He was not a construction worker. So at some point, his part in it was done. And we moved to the States. We moved to New York City and then to Buffalo. And, you know, we were there for a very few years. You know, I remember it as a long time. I was a little kid, 3-4 years, maybe even only 3. I don't know. My mom was, you know, when we were talking about this book, when I was writing it, she was somewhat taken aback in that she said, you know, we really barely lived there, you know, and it really looms large in my childhood. So I wondered if that, you know, it was a town of trailer park. It was a trailers. The town was a trailer park, I should say. And I wondered if it was still there. You know, what was it like there? Was the dam still operational? You know, it was, 40 years ago. I didn't know any of this stuff. So I started to do my research and to look around and to try to learn about what had happened. And lo and behold, most of the information that I found, I didn't find any information about the town, or if there were still Manitoba Hydro workers who lived up there and worked on the dam. I couldn't find any of that on the internet. This place is remote, you know, it's hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, 500 kilometers or something like that, north of Winnipeg in the Canadian forest. Now, Canada is, you've seen it on a map, the huge, huge percentage, don't quote me, but like, you know, the vast majority of Canadian people live within 100 kilometers of the US border. It's what we think of Canada population-wise is pretty much against the border in the southern part. The northern part of Canada is settled and populated mostly with Indigenous people, but the vast majority of the population, in fact, in a huge number of the population, is actually in the Greater Toronto area. So when we think of Canada as a national space, the physical geography of Canada, most of that is very sparsely populated and off the, I don't know about off the grid, but off the main paths. So even when we lived up there as a young family, there was a dirt road. There was a trunk highway, road that went up from Winnipeg all the way to Churchill, which is on the Hudson Bay. But the town that we were on was off a dirt road for several hours from that road itself. And Pimicikamak First Nation is called Cross Lake First Nation. Also, they didn't even have a road. It was a fly-in only community, except in the winters when the lake froze over and you could drive. So it was remote, you know. I wasn't thinking, I was living in Ohio and I was not thinking that I was going to go back there. I was not thinking this was going to be like some field work that I was doing. I really just wanted some internet research on this place. And I couldn't find anything out about the town. I couldn't find anything out about if there were still workers up there. That type of information wasn't like easily accessible at the first go around. But what did come up was a lot of information about Cross Lake, the indigenous community. And at that very time, it was my first foray into this was 2014 or 15, I forget the exact details, but it was must have been the winter of, it was when the suicide epidemic happened. So in fact, it must have been the winter of 2016. The suicide epidemic. Okay, we're gonna get, I'm getting at this. If we were here together, this would be a little different, but pretend that I'm talking to you live and that I just have to cut out before Q&A. What did come up was that the community was litigating with Manitoba Hydro for treaty violations, and that the dam had impacted the local ecosystem, and that the mitigation promises for the damage were not met, that the community was in crisis, that there was a lot of economic impact, the more sustainable traditional ways of life were disrupted because the shore erosion that came from the dam impacted fishing. It had repercussions up and down the food chain. So that affected hunting, a lot of different impacts from this dam that was still, yes, operational. And what I then learned about was that there had been a suicide epidemic among the young people, that 4 young people in the senior class of one of the high schools had died, and 2 more young people in the community. And that in the following several months, there were 125 more attempted suicides. And we're talking about a community of about 6,000 people. So it was a tremendous crisis that the community was in. The Canadian National News Station, the CBC, had gone and done a big story. All of this stuff was happening. And I didn't know how to incorporate this into the work that I was doing, which was this small other book, So what happened was I just went online, I found the website of the Pimicikamak Nation, and I wrote to my cat is coming here because she cannot leave me alone when I'm on the computer, sorry. I wrote to the chief. It happened that there was a woman chief. I thought that was interesting, and I wrote to her and I said, I grew up in that town near the dam, and what's going on? Like, can you summarize it for me? Can you point me in the direction of, news articles or statements from the government, whatever it is, like just help me to figure out what happened. And this was the turning point in my work. Was she wrote back, and almost immediately, and she did not answer any of my questions. She said, I quote the email in the book, but she said, if you want to know, she said, it's so wonderful that you want to remember about your childhood in our nation. So she was being really clear with me that I, in fact grew up on, and I grew up on unceded treaty land, which was Pimicikamak territory, leased to Manitoba Hydro for the purposes of building and maintaining this dam. She said, please come and we'll show you what's going on. It was not in my line of thought to go up there. I didn't even know how to get there. I thought, fly into Winnipeg? Is there an airport? Will I have to rent a car? Is the dirt road? Is there a bridge now? I didn't know any of this stuff, and but I knew I had to go. So it was very interesting to me, and we're going to talk about this concept of creed narrative memory in a second, but that idea that what I needed could not be told on the phone, or could not be read about at a distance, that I had to go to the land. I had to be there physically, on the land with the people. She was very clear about that. And so she put me in touch with one of the other council members, a guy named Leroy Muswagon. And I talked to Leroy, and he was like, "What's this about? What do you want to know? Why is this important to you?" And I really had to explain to him, like, this maybe was about trying to understand my childhood. And I said, "You guys were a part of my life, and I never knew. And I never came to Gross Lake. I never met you. And I don't think that I can understand anything about what happened to me until I understand what happened." And he said, "Okay, come by." And he said, I said, "I'm planning on coming on such and such a day. I'm going to come on Sunday, and then I'll do meetings from Monday through Friday and learn as much as I can." He said, "Come a day early, come for the whole weekend." And he said, "Because what we want is for you to come into the Sweat Lodge with us, because we want you to experience, something of our culture and something of our ceremony. And we feel that you will then understand more where we're coming from, that this isn't about a territorial control for us, that this is not about a political chess game with the Canadian government, or the Manitoba government, but that our sovereignty is intrinsic to the way that we think about the land, the place that we live." And I was nervous. I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't know what I thought. I thought, is this transactional? Am I going to be, I don't know, do they think they're purifying me in some way? Will there be an expectation of me after I go through this? I didn't know. I know it may sound, unimportant. Well, I should just go and then go about my business and do whatever I want. But I really believed in some way of, like, this is a sacred ceremony. It's a community ceremony. It's not a ceremony that outsiders are just randomly invited, to take part in. There's a very dim view of the kind of tourist type of experiences with the Indigenous that maybe is much more common here in the United States. You can go on an ayahuasca retreat. You can find some shaman to take you into the desert. And I'm not saying that the people who are doing that are legitimate, and that actual Indigenous communities here may, really frown on that. But I'm saying American people, plenty of people do things like that. And they pay a lot of money to go to really expensive kind of retreat centers and what have you to have those experiences. This is not the norm of how this viewed like that in Canada. I think that maybe because of the Truth and Reconciliation process that happened there, there's a little bit of a keener understanding of the concept of cultural appropriation and that kind of thing. That there's not going to be someone in a strip mall or something like that, doing teaching you Indigenous healing practices or what have you. So I knew that it was serious, and they were really, this was a big deal that they were asking me to go through this, and I wanted to. I don't know, I needed to think about it a little bit. So I called my friend, Layli Long Soldier, who some of you may know. She's an amazing Indigenous American Native poet, and Lakota, but grew up all over the place, including not on the reservation. And she lived on Navajo reservation for many years, married to a Navajo guy at the time. I don't think anymore. Well, let's not talk about that. I'm gonna edit that part out. Hold on a second. Actually, I don't know how to edit it out. Don't worry about it. So I called her and we chatted, and she said, don't go in if you aren't willing to be changed. she said, you know, Indigenous spirituality is not transactional. They're not expecting something of you, they're sharing with you. They're a community and they're expressing a willingness to include you. They trust you and they want to trust you more. And if you do this, they, you know, they will understand that you don't want to just report on them. You don't want to, you know, capitalize on whatever your connection is with them. This is a hard issue for me, thinking about writing a book about this and what I then owe to the community after it. And I don't mind telling you, I feel that there is some relationship that still exists there. And I want to continue working with this community, you know, moving into the future. And hopefully this book will give me the opportunity to do that. So anyhow, I want to move off of that a little bit. So I did do that on the very first day that I arrived. I went straight from the airport to Leroy's house, where there's a sweat lodge structure, and I went in and I participated in the sweat lodge. I want to talk just briefly. I do want to read you a little chunk from this book, and that'll close out this whole presentation. But I do want to talk briefly to you because now, as I mentioned to you, I did not do a lot of this reading and research while I was there. A lot of it was after, as I was shaping the story and coming to understand the story. And so I gave you this reading about Cree narrative memory from the Indigenous writer Neil Milkweed. I think it's a very interesting, the concept that he talks about, which is narrative memory as intergenerational memory and as collective memory. And that, as he quotes the writer Vine Deloria, saying that Indigenous people tend to envision their collective memory in terms of space rather than time. So it's intergenerational, yet it's centered around whatever the locality is. So it is not that the Indigenous people didn't travel. There was a rich network of trade across all of the river systems of the Canadian North, but that territory of Pimicikamak, in their recollections, their own oral histories, it has been Pimicikamak territory going back thousands of years. They say before that we had our language. And true enough, there was an archaeologist from Minnesota named Will Gilmore who did find artifacts and was able to show that the presence of Pimicikamak, cultural presence in that area, he dates it back 12,000 years. So we're talking about an ancient, by any stretch, ancient civilization in that part of the world of these people. So one of the things that changed with the coming of the Canadians was a shift in, not only a literal shift in the landscape in terms of the physical changes wrought in the landscape by the dam and by the river, but also the cartographic change in the landscape and the mapping of the landscape. And interestingly enough, now oftentimes we have Indigenous names that stay in those areas. However, in a lot of places in Canada, the names themselves may be Indigenous, but they're not necessarily connected in the geographic way as you think. So for example, the word Manitoba for the province of Manitoba, it was created by the European settlers from a Cree word, Manito, for creator, but there wasn't a place called Manitoba that was there, a historic place called Manitoba. They made that name Manitoba to have an Indigenous name for that province. Same with Saskatchewan, which is an Indigenous word, but it's the name of a certain river that flows through, and it flows through the southern part of the province, and it even flows into Manitoba. So it's come to mean this region, but it doesn't have a historical concordance, if you understand what I mean. And on top of all of that, the word Canada itself was the Iroquois word for that region around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River where they lived. That was called Canada. And some people say it's the word for village. And there is, in fact, a little town, it's still there outside Ottawa, called Canada. but that word came to mean the entire part of the province. So not only were the places changed, but the nomenclature, the taxonomy, the topography, big boulders were shattered to build buildings. Like they actually changed the landscape physically as well. This idea of intergenerational collective memory means that the language politics, which are generational, I have to add, I'll talk about it in a second, but the concept of reteaching the language and awakening that concept of collective narrative memory does become, as Neil MacLeod puts it, a part of decolonizing Cree consciousness. So we're not only returning the language and just learning the words, but we're also learning the concept of history and how history gets told. I think it's really important, this concept of what history actually is. And so he quotes the writer Philip Deloria, and Philip Deloria is talking about the Apache Nation. He says, Apaches do not simply live in a static, mythic world. They create new histories about newly created places, revealing the gaps and fissures in any scheme that would sift our temporal distinctions among native histories. So this is really important. Not only, as at the beginning, Vine Deloria says that narrative consciousness is set in place rather than time, but here we have an example of how history is not actually a fixed thing, that it changes and that it unrolls and unfolds. So that connection to language that I was just talking about, it is generational in that at a certain point, when the residential school system, which is similar to the one we had in the United States, especially in that its very stated programmatic goal was to interrupt cultural transmission and convert, not only religiously, but culturally convert Indigenous people into European Canadians. And the residential school system in Canada continued actively all the way through the 70s, the 80s. The last residential school didn't close its doors until 1996. So this is still new there. And there is a language break of students who never learned Cree. And I met the superintendent of the schools actually in Cross Lake, who says his older daughter is 37. She speaks Cree. The youngest daughter is 24. She doesn't speak a word of it. So there's a line. So now they are developing this in Cross Lake and in other places, a language reclamation that is beginning in kindergarten and then going up year by year by year. And they're at the same time simultaneously training the teachers and creating the educational materials. And so whenever they started, I don't remember the year, but the intention is in 13 years from K through 12, it will be Cree taught or bilingual taught at very least. So it's kind of exciting times in terms of all of this stuff is like in process active, actually. So I want to say a little bit about this notion of history and orality. So you automatically have the importance of the elder and the importance of the transmission from the elder to the younger. It is compounded by the fact that some knowledge is considered proprietary knowledge, that it would never be written down, that it would only be given from one person to another. This is things like how to do the sweat lodge ceremony. What are the herbs that are used in the water? This kind of knowledge. It's not given to an outsider. So even to me, I was invited to be in the sweat lodge. I sat with them so I could see what was happening, but they're at no point where they were explaining in the ritual, like, and now there's a break, you can go outside, and now, we're gonna put more water on the fire. They pass the pipe around, and now we're gonna pass the pipe around. But they don't say what is in the medicine in the water. They don't explain what this sacred tobacco. this is proprietary knowledge, so that's privileged in the first place. In the second place, it is constantly it is very like, contemporary in terms of the philosophical overview, but there's always this acceptance that we don't know everything. So oftentimes, as he explains in the reading, that I hope you had a chance to read, he says the elders will begin the story with, "I don't know very much," or "It was told to me like this, but I don't know for sure. I wasn't there myself." So we build it in that this is knowledge that's been given to me, and I'm in a state of unknowing with it, that it can be interpreted. There is a concept of the oral track, by saying who taught you and where that person learned it from. It's like our version of footnotes. What we call documentation, they are, without paper, they are documenting it. It's also a knowledge that these stories are open-ended, and that the listener has to interpret them, that different elements of a story can be emphasized during a performance, and then you might hear a different rendering of that story that emphasizes other elements. This is as opposed to the Western legal doctrine of like originalism, where that's the written document, it is set, it is fixed, that's what we follow. And instead you have this sort of living tradition as it's passed down and maybe impacted and changed by whatever political or social events that are happening around you. Once again, it's related more to place rather than a sense of a linear history that I think we are more, this is our Western cultural context. I'm just going to close this little discussion with a quote from Linda Tuwai Smith, which is Neil MacLeod quotes her. "In order for history to begin, there has to be a period of beginning and some criteria for determining when something begins. In terms of history, this was often attached to concepts of discovery, the development of literacy, or the development of specific social formation. Everything before that time is designated as prehistorical, belonging to the realm of myths and traditions outside the domain." So as we learned, is most often the colonial powers and the academics of the colonial powers will think about the oral tradition of Indigenous people as myths or legends or stories, and not as a legitimate and vibrant way of telling the history itself. So I think that was a very, very critical moment for me, was realigning my understanding of the types of things that I was being told by the elders in Cross Lake and the ways that they were telling me the various different stories. And then coming back, of course, still to my own home and wanting to research and find out in my own way and the own way that I understand history about the types of things that I was learning for them. Cree narrative, this is Neil MacLeod, I'll just read this in conclusion. Cree narrative memory emerges from the worldview and spirituality of the Cree people and is grounded in the names of both ancestors and places. It's through our connections to storytellers and Kete Ayok that we are able to access this ancient collective memory. Cree narrative memory is ongoing and it's sustained through relationships, respect, and responsibility. Okay, so I'm going to read to you. I did say at the very beginning that I wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of ethics and responsibility. I did the graduate student tea, UCSD graduate student tea a couple of weeks ago, in which I, with Katie Walkowitz and some of the graduate students, in which I talk quite extensively about that. So I'm not going to talk to you about that today. I will leave you to, that is archived and you can look at it. So I'll leave you to look at that if you want to think more about the ethical considerations of doing this kind of the story work, as it's called, but I'm going to read to you just a short chapter from the book to give you a little bit of a flavor. So the book's called Northern Light. It's not yet out, so that you're getting a preview. It's going to be published by Milkweed Editions in March of 2021. Sorry, I found the wrong chapter. Okay, this is the day after the sweat lodge. Leroy had suggested I meet Jackson Osborne, a local elder and historian. To drive me, he sends Donald, a young man with a shaved head, round glasses, and a quiet air. We head back north along the lake in silence. We pass a small skate park and come to a driveway that serves 3 houses. Several dogs roam the yard. It seems like everyone has dogs here and no one keeps them inside. Jackson's house is small and modest, an actual constructed house, unlike the prefabricated trailers we saw in town. When Donald knocks, Jackson does not answer. Maybe he's not home, I ask. No, he's home, says Donald. I'm not sure how he knows. Perhaps he knows Jackson's car, or perhaps there is nowhere for Jackson to go. Donald opens the door. It slides across a little square of cardboard that has been laid inside the house to collect the ubiquitous mud. Donald calls out Jackson's name across the small living room. Jackson comes around the corner from the kitchen area. He is a small man with inquisitive eyes blinking behind big glasses. He's wearing a blue housecoat and has a jar of instant coffee in one hand and a tablespoon in the other. It is obvious he's not expecting us. Donald explains, Jackson, this is Kazim. He grew up in Genpeg when they were building the dam. He's come back to find out what is happening in Cross Lake. Jackson's eyes light up and he nearly crows with excitement. You grew up in Genpeg. You've come back. You came back to see us. He gestures us in. We remove our shoes on the cardboard and Jackson waves us toward the dining table while he bustles around the kitchen making coffee. The kettle is barely on the stove when he exclaims, I have so much to show you. And before I can say anything in response, he is off, disappearing up a short flight of stairs from the living room, which must lead to the bedrooms. I hear him clapping his hands and talking to himself. Donald smiles. We hear much shuffling of papers and sounds of drawers being opened and shut. Jackson reappears with 2 shoe boxes, which he places on the table between us, dragging his chair around so it is next to mine. He sits and opens the boxes. They are full of photographs. Look at these, he says. These are photographs of Cross Lake, the actual lake. The town is called Cross Lake because it's on a lake that's called Cross Lake. I go out at all different times of the year and take pictures of the lake shore so I can track the changes. See these shores? He points to the shoreline in the photographs. He turns one photo over and written there in spidery ballpoint is October 1989. Now I'll take you out to the same place and show you the photograph and show you the shore and you can see for yourself what happened. That's the picture on the cover of the book is Jackson holding up one of his photographs in front of the shoreline. That part is not in the chapter I'm reading. We sit and drink coffee while he pulls more photographs out of boxes to show to Donald and me. Jackson is something of a local historian, Leroy had told me. How many pictures do you have? I ask him. Oh, these are only part of them. I've been taking pictures going back to the 1980s. I didn't start out taking pictures though. I started out trying to get the schools to teach Cree language. My whole family was in the residential system, you know. I guess most of the older people in Cross Lake were, I said. That's right. And the whole time we were in there, we were serving Canada. My great-grandfather, James Whiskey, he fought for Canada and was killed in the First World War. And even though I have all these pictures here, we don't have any pictures of him and no medals, nothing to remember him by, just our stories. He gets up to pour the coffee and brings the cups back to the table for the 3 of us. I have never even been into his burial place, he says. It's in Europe somewhere with the other Canadian soldiers. We're quiet for a moment while we stir sugar into our cups. My sister went to the residential school near Brandon, and she didn't come back, he says. Her name was Betsy Osborne. She caught tuberculosis in the school and was sent to the sanatorium in Nanette near Brandon for medical testing. She died, but they never sent the body home. We don't even know where she's buried. I am silent. Jackson looks out the window. As I learned later, this kind of occurrence was not uncommon. Often the children who died in the residential schools, whether from the medical testing itself or from the rigors of hard labor or from suicide, were buried in unmarked graves. Well then, in 2011, there was a monument built, said Jackson, and a ceremony held for those who were subjected to the medical testing, but my sister's name wasn't on the list of names. He pauses. So now we don't know what happened to her, when she died, or where, or how. In 2018, Anne Lindsay, a researcher in Brandon, was able to locate the grave of 50 children from the residential school there in what is now an RV park by following a map that was hand drawn for her by one of the residential school survivors. In contrast, there is still little information about the tuberculosis patients who were sent to the sanatorium. One former employee claimed in 2009 that there were upwards of 200 former patients buried in underbrush a short drive from the facility. Jackson's family, like mine, is connected to the dam. His father worked as a porter and a guide for the original Manitoba Hydro team that surveyed the river in 1964. Oh, he was always happy, always cracking jokes, said Jackson. Here's pictures of him with the team, he says, passing them over. In all the pictures I see of Charlie Osborne, he is smiling. In one of them, Charlie is wearing the camp cook's white hat and apron and is pretending to cook. Later, continues Jackson, after the survey was complete and Hydro built the dam and the water levels started fluctuating, he regretted the work he did in helping the team to do the survey of the river. He's the one who told me to get a camera and to take pictures and document everything that was happening because of the dam. To this day, Jackson goes out regularly at all times of the day and in all seasons of the year to take photographs of the same views of the shoreline, so he can collate them together and assemble evidence of the shore erosion. He began in 1988, he tells me, around 10 years after the dam opened. I'm going to skip ahead and read you just a little bit more from here. Hold on a second. I just want to find a little chunk to read you that is really good that I want to. Okay. We continue to look at his photographs. He shows me some big floating branches in the river. What happens, he explains, is that because of the shore erosion, after the trunks rot and the soil breaks apart, the root systems of the dead trees float off into the river. We call them spiders, and they interfere with the motors of the boats, and they sometimes cause them to capsize. The water rises and falls because of the dam. The shore is chewed away, and the trees die. In the pictures Jackson shows me, it almost looks like a tornado has come through and shattered the trees. Changes in the silt levels have made Cross Lake's water undrinkable, and sediment has affected the spawning patterns of local fish populations. Now the sturgeon, the whitefish, and the pickerel are gone, and without the fish, the muskrats, the wolverines, and bears and beavers are gone too. There's no more trapping, and there's very little hunting. One has to drive far out past the old trap lines to hunt for deer and moose. Some people even commission small planes to fly them even farther, often 700 kilometers into the forest, to hunt. How was this allowed to happen? The province began surveying the northern river systems in the mid-1960s, and by 1971 it had determined, based on a survey report, that the Nelson was ideal for generating hydroelectricity and that its flow could be increased by diverting several other waterways into the Nelson, both before and after the dam. Brian Grover, the leader of the original survey team, wrote that the waters of the Nelson were, quote, clear, of high quality, so clean and fresh that we drank it directly from the river. The province set about negotiating the terms with the 5 First Nations that would be affected by the changes in the water level. These included Cross Lake, Nelson House, Norway House, Split Lake, and York Factory. Although construction began in 1974, it wasn't until 1977 that the 5 bands came to terms with Manitoba Hydro, the provincial government, and the federal government in a treaty called the Northern Flood Agreement. The Northern Flood Agreement is a slender document running about 75 pages and full of legal language that traffics in promises to remediate the environmental impact of the dam, even while it is careful to say such outcomes are unknown and unpredictable, and that full remediation may prove to be impossible. Accepting an offer to compensate each participating band with a 4-to-1 ratio of acres in exchange for land ceded, the Cross Lake band surrendered all land on their reserve contiguous to the Nelson River and lower than 690 feet above sea level. An essential part of the treaty was the promise by Manitoba Hydro that they would control the flow of water on the regulated waterways so they do not exceed 687 feet above sea level, and that they would prevent inundation of reserve lands. But neither of these provisions has been effectively managed. It was in light of these abrogations that in 2014, the Pimicikamak contested Manitoba Hydro's claims to those ceded lands by occupying the site of the Genpeg generating station and serving eviction papers. For his part, the original survey team leader, Brian Grover, came to regret his role in surveying the river and enabling construction of the dam. The extreme underdevelopment in Cross Lake, the community that had participated in the surveys and had hosted and assisting with the building of the dam, distressed him. First Nations people, Brian Grover wrote in 2016, were present long before immigrant settlers arrived from many other countries and should be able to enjoy the high standard of living which most other Canadians have achieved. Grover recognized that the mineral and energy wealth of Indigenous peoples has been diverted and does not provide them with material benefits. Grover, too, speaks of Charlie Osborne's regret with sadness. This is a quote. Charlie reportedly told his family that he regretted having done the work he did with me and with many other technical people from the southern communities. He stated that he would not have done this work if he understood the consequences which followed. Brian Grover's book, The Summer of '64 on the Nelson River, is dedicated to the 4 members of the survey team from Cross Lake, including Charlie Osborne. Grover's remembrances, like my own, were not incidental. His renewed interest and the writing of his memoir stemmed from the same sense of urgency that drew me back to Genpeg and Cross Lake, the suicide epidemic among the young people that winter. Grover had realized that while the vast majority of material benefits from the dam in the north go to residents of the southern parts of the provinces and also to some northern US cities in Minnesota and North Dakota, the environmental, economic, and social costs are borne by the northern Indigenous populations. So that's all I'll read from that project. And I hope you will have a discussion amongst yourselves about Cree narrative memory and about Indigenous story work from the readings I gave you. And I'm happy to set up a time to chat, a coffee hour or something, and we can talk more about it. Okay, thanks everybody.